about what's been going on this week. Another busy week, good week for Canada. And I'll just say a few words about what we've been building. Building defense capabilities at home, building trust and partnerships with our allies, and building new opportunities here in Saudi Arabia. On Monday in Halifax, we announced the largest defense procurement in Canadian history, and we're now in the process, beginning the process of negotiating up to 12 state-of-the-art submarines from TKMS. This is historic, not just for the new capability that we're going to deliver to Canadian submariners, but also for the speed and ambition, the efficiency and the impact of the procurement process. We received, reviewed, and selected bids in less than a year, 5 years ahead of the original schedule, and that's a change to process. I know it sounds wonky and boring, but it's an important change to process the defense industrial strategy in action. Lundi, nous avons choisi de produire à notre façon la capacité souveraine dont nous allons avoir besoin pour défendre nos côtes, notre Arctique et notre population. En ce moment, les menaces que nous faisons face sont tangibles. Le Canada est prêt à défendre ses intérêts, ses citoyennes et citoyens, et ses alliés qui vont les affronter. Nous augmentons rapidement nos capacités en faisant des investissements historiques dans de nouveaux sous-marins, évidemment, le radar trans-horizon, des brise-glaces, des avions et des capacités de cyberdéfense. The generational investments we're making in the Canadian Armed Forces meant that on Tuesday, for the first time in 40 years, nearly 40 years, Canada arrived at a NATO summit with our defense investments and capacity on a clear upward trajectory. Already hit NATO's 2% target. We're on a clear path to 5% by 2035, which is the NATO objective. We arrived in Ankara as a stronger, more capable member of the alliance. At the summit, I met with President Erdogan, where we agreed to launch negotiations on a new free trade agreement with Turkey, a trade agreement that can unlock billions in trades between our two countries. We signed new defense contracts that will grow our industrial base and jobs at home in Canada. We agreed to open negotiations to join NATO's Innovation Sub-Fund and announced that Canada will host NATO's 2027 Industry Forum, a sign of our ambition in building jobs and growth here at home. As we build our strength at home, we're also deploying it abroad. In Ankara, we announced that Canada will extend Operation Reassurance to 2031, and that's the Canadian-led brigade in Latvia. It's our largest overseas mission, and we're increasing it, deploying more personnel for a total ground presence of about 2,600. That's Canadian soldiers, joined by 15 other nations of the NATO alliance. Canada will now stand as the third framework nation of a multinational Division North alongside Latvia and Denmark, taking even greater responsibility for NATO's eastern flank. Partant du travail que nous avions commencé à Montréal au printemps, nous avons rallié de nouveaux appuis autour de la Banque de la Défense, de la sécurité et de la résilience. Cette institution dirigée par le Canada et basée au Canada va mobiliser des capitaux privés pour notre sécurité collective. À Ankara, 8 de nos alliés et partenaires ont accepté de soutenir la banque, ce qui va nous permettre d'accélérer sa mise en place et d'augmenter son influence potentielle. Ajoutons à cela que notre engagement envers l'Ukraine reste indéfectible. Nous avons accordé de nouveaux fonds de munitions, la défense aérienne, des véhicules blindés et de l'équipement essentiel, et cela fait partie du soutien général que nous offrons et qui a fait du Canada l'un des plus importants partenaires de l'Ukraine depuis le début de cette guerre terrible. I also held a series of bilateral meetings, including with the NATO Secretary General, leaders from over a dozen countries. So through new investments, through deeper industrial and defense partnerships, strengthened support for Ukraine, expanded role in reinforcing NATO's eastern flank, Canada is delivering on our commitments and helping to build a stronger and more secure NATO. Here today in Jeddah, we are building partnerships with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, harnessing the ambitions of our nations to catalyze greater security, prosperity, and opportunity for both our peoples. We signed, Canadian and Saudi businesses have signed 13 new commercial agreements across education, critical minerals and mining, energy, infrastructure, security, artificial intelligence. In education, agreements to train workers in some of the Kingdom's most dynamic industries, building the skills that will power its next decade of growth. In critical minerals and mining, new Canadian engineering partnerships are working on some of the most ambitious mining projects here, unlocking over $2 trillion of mineral wealth. In energy and infrastructure, Canadian expertise is supporting roads, rails, and urban development across the Kingdom, along with clean building technologies that help it build sustainably. And in defense and security, new training partnerships support the Kingdom's efforts to build domestic aviation and defense industry capabilities. artificial intelligence, Canadian AI and health technology partnerships are helping to transform patient monitoring, diagnostics, and surgical care. We're aiming to conclude negotiations with Saudi Arabia for a foreign investment promotion and protection agreement by the first quarter of next year. Canada's Minister of Finance, who's here, intends to lead a delegation of Canadian pension funds and their $2 trillion of capital to visit the Kingdom in coming months to identify new investment opportunities. And Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund will visit Canada in the fall, attending our Canada Investment Summit, which showcase some of our transformative projects. Canada is also announcing that we will participate in Expo 2030 here in Saudi, bringing Canadian projects expertise, showcasing the best of Canada at what will be a landmark event. I would like to thank His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince, and the Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia for his hospitality and for our rich discussions this afternoon. Canada and Saudi Arabia have growing cooperation across key sectors, some of which I've referenced, but also want to recognize the Kingdom's broader efforts to promote regional stability and security. So in 4 days, in 3 countries, we've worked to build our strength, to build trust with our allies, to build a new partnership with the world. In this time of uncertainty, we're choosing to act, we're choosing to build Canada strong. And with that, I look forward to your questions. Et on peut commencer avec...
Nous allons maintenant commencer les questions. Première question, first question.
Avec monsieur, pardon.
Graham.
Prime Minister, previous government spoke about their differences with Saudi Arabia publicly in many ways. If I understand you correctly, for instance, on human rights, you can have differences and discussions behind closed doors. But you can also do everything else that you have described. Why do you think that's the way to go now, as opposed to what happened sort of 2018 in that sort of more challenging time between the two governments?
Well, I'm going to take your question more generally about our approach, as you began, if that's okay, and you can follow up if that's not sufficient. Look, we recognize a couple of things. One is that engagement is not endorsement. So engaging with a country doesn't mean that we agree with everything that a country is doing. In fact, I can't think of a country on the planet where we would agree with everything that they're doing, first point. No country is Canada, and we don't even agree with everything that's happening in Canada. Better is always possible, including for Canada. So that's the first. The second is that we recognize in a world that's more dangerous, that's more divided, a world where we need to diversify our partnerships, where we become over-reliant on a partner with whom we share many things. The United States, obviously, we share many things, and we value that partnership, but we're over-reliant, and that's been demonstrated. Canadians have very strongly recognized that, and we're looking to diversify. So we are actively engaging with key partners around the world. We are calibrating those engagements depending on alignment and depending on our interests. Part of our interests is to build our strategic capabilities. In other words, to build in areas that make Canada more resilient, stronger, more independent. And where there's complementarities, we do that. And then the last element, it's not the last element, but last element I'll hand back, is we recognize as a government the importance of countries that are active and influential in geographies in the world and in situations in the world about which we care deeply. Canada has always cared deeply about the Middle East. Canada has since before Deepin Baker, I'm going to stretch it back, I should stretch back to, since 1948, actually, has supported a two-state solution. I'll give the example of the 2 countries that I've been to on this trip. 2 of the most influential countries with respect to potential solutions there are Saudi Arabia and Turkey. We need to engage with these countries. We need to be speaking with them. We need to work with them. That doesn't mean that they have the key to unlock things, but not being engaged, not talking to them on level. I'm the first Prime Minister to come here in 25 years. I was the first Prime Minister to speak to President Erdogan in over a decade. Speak to him. Let me meet with him. And so it's about recognizing where we can have influence, where we can build resilience, independence, strength, Canada, calibrating appropriately, and also creating a situation and a dialogue where we can raise issues. And because we have influence and because we have partnerships, we have a greater chance of positive outcomes and positive progress in those issues. So it's probably longer than you wanted, but that's...
Last point on this for me, that you, again, if I hear you correctly, emphasizing those disagreements, particularly publicly, doesn't really get countries like Canada anywhere. The critics would say that you are so focused on business and jobs and money that you're just looking away from those other things, and I'm assuming you would see that differently.
I definitely see that differently. I do see that lecturing countries from afar is an ineffective strategy. It's satisfying, but it's ineffective. Engagement can be effective. It doesn't mean it's always effective. It doesn't mean it's decisive, but it can be effective. We care deeply about human rights. We care deeply about self-determination for nations. We care deeply about territorial integrity of nations. We care deeply about Canadian consular cases. I addressed a Canadian consular case in Ankara 2 days ago. And because I was with the president, it was addressed favorably. If I sat in Ottawa and pointed out all the things that we might not agree with what Turkey has done or is doing or might do, I wouldn't have had that conversation. I wouldn't have had that impact. That's a small example, but it is an example of a broader point. Madame.
Si on y va plus justement par des exemples, est-ce que vous avez concrètement parlé de droits humains, de droits de la personne avec le prince héritier? Et je prends l'exemple de Raif Badawi, qui est ce blogueur dont la famille est au Canada actuellement, a trouvé refuge au Canada. Lui est interdit de quitter le territoire saoudien actuellement. Est-ce qu'un cas comme ça, c'est un cas que vous pourriez ou que vous avez même peut-être souligné auprès du prince héritier?
Premièrement, en ce qui concerne les discussions privées, un des avantages des discussions privées, ils sont privés. Et si on a un transcript des discussions privées, ils sont des discussions publiques. Alors, je reste comme ça en ce qui concerne des discussions avec n'importe quel chef d'État ou chef de gouvernement dans le cas de le prince héritier ici. En ce qui concerne la situation dont vous parlez, oui, c'est une situation difficile, très difficile pour la famille, pour l'individu ici, la famille au Canada. Et c'est un des exemples des cas où, au fil du temps, avec l'engagement, on pourrait aider des gens ou on peut aider dans des situations comme cela. Mais je suis le premier Premier ministre d'être ici depuis plus de 25 années. Alors, et c'est une des membres les plus importants du G20. Alors, il faut engager, il faut renforcer, Madame la ministre des Affaires étrangères était ici il y a quelques semaines, est ici aujourd'hui. Elle a soulevé quelques cas consulaires avec son homologue et on va continuer comme ça.
Vous avez dit que l'Arabie saoudite était en transformation. Au chapitre des droits humains, des droits des femmes particulièrement,
oui.
Il y en demeure pas moins que c'est l'un des pays qui a le pire bilan au monde. Qu'est-ce que vous avez vu, vous, qui vous fait dire que cette société est en transformation?
Alors, c'est pas pour moi d'être le juge ici, mais vous me demandez d'un exemple. OK. Il y a juste une décennie, je crois, alors une quinzaine d'années peut-être, mais le taux de participation des femmes dans le marché du travail était, je ne sais pas, 10%, 12%, quelque chose comme ça. Maintenant, c'est plus élevé qu'en Inde, au Japon. Ici, en Arabie saoudite, il y a du progrès ici. Ce n'est pas pour moi d'être le juge, mais je peux voir. La première fois que j'ai visité ce pays, c'était en 1994. On peut voir, si on a un record d'être ici, on peut voir avec les yeux le progrès. Il y a des progrès, il y a un rythme ici. Mais ce n'est pas le Canada. Le Canada est le meilleur pays du monde dans tous les contextes, mais surtout en ce qui concerne les droits des femmes, les droits des individus, les droits de n'importe quelle identité. Alors, ça c'est un exemple. Can I follow through these questions? I'm worried about time.
Prime Minister, most of the people you met today, most of the Saudi officials you met today, are major players led by the Crown Prince in this Vision 2030 exercise, a vast plan to modernize and diversify the Saudi economy.
Right.
Even that, huge resources, all hands on deck. From the beginning, it's run into substantial rough patches, cost overruns, expropriation problems.